Hello old sports, and welcome back to a brand new stagey review here on my channel. Today's the day! Today I will be sharing with you my thoughts and feelings on The Great Gatsby musical currently at the London Coliseum. So grab some moonshine and maybe your favourite old flapper dress and let's get into this. If you're new here, let me catch you up real quick on how this is gonna work. My name's Flora and I have lots, and I mean lots of opinions when it comes to theatre, and those are opinions that I like sharing with you guys for better or for worse here on YouTube. Am I qualified to have these opinions? Some might say no, but I'm gonna share them anyway. Before I get into my reviews, I always like to give you guys a little bit of background on the production that I'm talking about, as well as a synopsis, so that we're all on the same page before we really get into the meat of the review, where I break it down into my highlights and my lowlights, basically what I liked and what I didn't. And then finally, everything shared in this review is nothing but my own opinion, and you are perfectly welcome to disagree with me. In fact, I encourage you to. And then finally, for today, I would like to give a big thank you to the team over at The Great Gatsby for having me along, because without them and JWoo Social, I don't think seeing this show would have been a reality for me, so I am very grateful that I got the opportunity to attend. Right, now that's all out of the way, let's get on with the show. And first things first, a little background on this musical. Now, there have actually been a total of 4 different musical adaptations of The Great Gatsby, with the 2023 Broadway production being the 3rd adaptation, and it was this 2023 Broadway production that ended up transferring to the West End. The 2023 musical had music and lyrics by Jason Howland, who some of you might know in connection to the Little Women musical, as well as Nathan Tyson, who I think is probably most well known for his work on Tuck Everlasting. And this version of The Great Gatsby's book was by Kate Kerrigan, and it began its journey with a 1-month limited run off Broadway at the Paper Mill Playhouse. This Broadway tryout began its run on the 12th of October 2023 with an official opening night 10 days later and ran through the month until November. The production then transferred to Broadway for previews on the 29th of March 2024, and it officially opened on April 25th. This Broadway show opened with a cast including the likes of Jeremy Jordan and Evelyn Noblezada in the leading roles of Jay Gatsby and Daisy Buchanan, with Samantha Pauly and Noah J. Ricketts as Jordan and Nick. This Broadway production was then announced to be transferring to the West End in 2025, marking the show's European debut. It has literally just opened at the London Coliseum. Now, I know some people are going to quibble as to whether the London Coliseum is a West End or off West End venue, but all of the marketing says West End, so I think we're going to carry on calling it the West End production of The Great Gatsby from now on. And it literally opened only a couple days ago, with previews starting on the 11th of April 2025 and official opening night being the 24th of April 2025. So hopefully, if I can edit in time, literally the day before this video goes up. And the show is currently booking through until the 7th of September, so you've got plenty of time to go and check it out if this review so sways you. This West End cast includes Jamie Moscato as Jay Gatsby and Frances Maylin McCann as Daisy Buchanan. They are joined by Corbin Bleu as Nick Carraway and Amber Davies as Jordan Baker. And the West End production is, as far as I'm aware, near as damn it a one-to-one replica of what is available to be seen on Broadway. There is also a North American tour scheduled for sometime in 2026, but details are very few and far between for that, so I'm going to leave the background of the production there for you guys before telling you a little bit about the synopsis of what The Great Gatsby is about. Of course, The Great Gatsby is based on a novel of the same name by F. Scott Fitzgerald, a novel that came out in 1925. I'm obviously not going to go plot point by plot point when telling you a little bit about this, as I feel like it's something you should go and see for yourself and watch plot point for plot point. So here is my kind of very abridged, possibly uneducated sounding version of what The Great Gatsby is about. The story of The Great Gatsby centers around one Jay Gatsby, a man with a mysterious past and seemingly like bottomless wealth. Like, this guy is rich, and Gatsby's really well known for like his lavish parties. They are the talk of the town. They are the hottest invitation to try and get, right? They are filled with the glitz and glam of the jazz age and that very much sort of flapper era. However, all of this wealth and luxury is actually just a facade Jay Gatsby is putting up in an attempt to win back the one true love in his life, Daisy Buchanan, who just so happens to live across the sound from him. Daisy is, however, already married to a guy called Tom Buchanan, who low-key is kind of a dick. The entire story is really driven and narrated through the eyes of Nick Carraway, who is Daisy Buchanan's cousin. He has moved to New York after the war to try his hand at sort of making a bit of money, living the American dream, you know? And Nick actually ends up renting the cabin that is next door to Gatsby's big mansion, and through all of this, he ends up really entangled in this kind of complex web of feelings and personal relationships and money and gangsters that he probably wasn't expecting when he moved to New York. He ends up becoming relatively good friends with Gatsby, or at least as friends friendly with Gatsby as I think we see anyone get in the show, and kind of becomes Gatsby's closest confidant in his quest to sort of win Daisy back. Aside from this sort of like romance storyline that we have going on, The Great Gatsby is also a story that touches on other topics, including wealth and deception, and it also kind of touches on the darker things that were happening in the 1920s, away from all of the glitz and glam, shedding a little bit of a light on the kind of high society partygoers as to what may be lurking underneath all of that glitz and glam. And in case you haven't read or watched The Great Gatsby, I'm gonna leave it there so as not to spoil every plot beat for you. Yet again, the book did come out literally like 100 years ago, so if you have managed to avoid spoilers thus far, I'm very impressed. But hopefully now you guys know a little bit more about what The Great Gatsby is about. Let's move on to what I knew about the show prior to going and seeing it. Now, this being a brand new show to the West End, it opening literally like 2 weeks ago, I of course hadn't seen it before going in and seeing it when I did. Of course, this was a show that found massive success on TikTok, so I have seen clips here and there. Today's a day! But other than that, I don't really feel like I've been exposed to the show a whole lot. It's not even a Broadway cast album that I've listened to a whole lot. Because of its success on TikTok, I of course was familiar with some songs like New Money and Only Tea. Today's a day! But those were the only numbers that I had sort of even heard little snippets from, really. I will say I was very privileged to have been invited to the cast announcement and launch party for this musical way back in February, so I had actually heard Jamie Moscato and Frances Mayley McCann perform some numbers from the show before anyone else did, which was a real treat.
I've done it all for her. Put up each wall for her. But the status quo, just one thing to go. Now she has to know it's all for her. I had this feeling as I was falling. The sound across the bay was the sound of you calling.
This means that I knew our two leads were very capable of carrying this show on their shoulders before ever getting to see them grace the stage. Speaking of the cast, this is also a cast that I have seen a lot of them in a lot of other productions. I saw Jamie when he was JD in Heathers way back when. I also got the chance to see him in Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812. And I have seen Frances as Bonnie in Bonnie and Clyde, so know from experience that they are both excellent musical theatre leads. Amber Davis, who was playing Jordan, I had seen in the Pretty Woman UK tour. Joel Montague, I know as King George from when I went to see Hamilton on the West End. And of course, I know Corbin Bleu because I was a Disney Channel child growing up, so I was very familiar with his work in many DCOMs, though my personal favourite of his was Jump In. So this was a cast I was very familiar with, even if it wasn't a sort of show I was very familiar with, if you will. In fact, the London Coliseum for me was also a new venue. I had never been inside before, so all in all, this was a very new experience for me. I think I should also note now, before we get into everything else I'm about to say, I have never read The Great Gatsby, and I think that is going to influence my review of the show. I watched the movie once in history class, but other than that, I feel like I'm not exactly an expert when it comes to The Great Gatsby. I feel like the book is so iconic and so well known that much of its text and context is something I just kind of like inherently know about, even though I've never read the book. But my review isn't going to be a critical analysis of how well the musical takes the source text and translates it to the stage. I'm very much coming at this from a, is it a good musical kind of point of view, viewing it more in isolation as opposed to viewing it as an adaptation of the source material. But hopefully that is enough background on the show, as well as my opinions and stances on The Great Gatsby as a show prior to going and seeing it. But I'm sure it's the review you guys are really all here for, so let's kick it off with the highlights. The first highlight we are going to start with is going to be the vocals. Usually I just take a moment to talk nice about the cast, but today I have decided to focus in solely on the vocals because they were nothing short of wow. Now, if you know anything about the Great Gatsby musical, then you know that our original Broadway Gatsby was the man, the myth, the musical theatre legend, Jeremy Jordan. Now, Jeremy Jordan, along with the rest of the original Broadway cast, I think set the bar for what people expect for vocal performances from this show extremely high. I will admit I was nervous because because of that. I knew deep down that Jamie Moscato could match Jeremy Jordan's vocals as Gatsby any day of the week. Fun fact, both of them have also played JD in Heathers. And so has Ryan McCartan, who is also Jay Gatsby on Broadway. So maybe it was like a prerequisite for the role. But anyway, like I said earlier, I'd heard Jamie and Francis sing at the press launch. So like I knew they were more than capable of reaching the same standards that those Broadway performers set. But hearing their voices fill the London Coliseum was another thing entirely. Jamie Moscato's rendition of For Her gave me chills every time he sang it. His voice is genuinely so beautiful and rich and smooth that he, to me, was the perfect man to rise to the challenge of following in Jeremy Jordan's footsteps. Of course, I had seen him in other shows. I knew he was good at singing, but like I said, hearing his voice fill the Coliseum in the way it did, with just how flawless and effortless it seemed to him, was amazing. And I think this show, being so vocally strong, to me was just such a reminder of why I love musical theatre in the way that I do. Seeing performers at the height of their talent, performing material that they clearly love and making those performances seem so effortless is just such a wonderful feeling that, in my opinion, you can only get with live theatre. Nothing else can really replicate it. And I also feel like the fact that the whole cast being so strong, to the point that even Corbin Bleu, who is arguably the stunt cast in this show, wasn't like a standalone standout. To me, that's like, damn, yeah, they set the standards high. There was no moment where sort of you felt like cringing because a note maybe wasn't being hit quite right. There was no harmony that was slightly jarring because someone was off. Every note was in its place, and I feel like it's been a while since I've had a show where that was 100% the case. Other standout vocal moments for me were definitely Greenlight. I also think Rachel Tucker as Myrtle, performing the song, I think it was called One Way Road, did such an amazing job with what was such a big moment in the show. And again, her ability to get her vocals to the back of the venue, like I know she's got a microphone, but I feel like the projection was there on top of that. Like it was, like it gave me chills. I will say there were a few moments, not to get too negative too soon, but I will say there were a few moments where the cast seemed to lack stamina. But given how early into the run I saw this, it's completely understandable, as these are quite complex songs in many ways, and a lot of them are accompanied with pretty fast choreography. And so the stamina you need to carry those off, whilst yes, you need to build it in the rehearsal room, is something you're only going to keep gaining and improving on throughout the run of a show. So I'm sure if I saw it in 2 months' time, some songs would sound kind of completely different, or at least stronger, just because that stamina has been built up. So overall, I literally cannot fault the vocals in this show. I know I keep saying it and probably sound like a broken record, but it was the most vocally flawless performance I have ever witnessed. So of course I had to wax lyrical about it as my first highlight. Okay, up next, a thing I really liked about this musical was the way it managed to invoke this feeling of nostalgia for older musical productions, whilst at the same time being presented in a fresh way for modern audiences. This was achieved to me right out of the gate by including overtures at the start of Act 1 and Act 2. I feel like so many musicals nowadays just kind of start, it's like boom, blackout, and then the performers are on stage, either giving you some dialogue or starting a song. And so it was really lovely to see this musical start with overtures at each act, really easing you into the world you're about to see, allowing the lights to dim and then the show to start. On top of the overture, but definitely still music related, is the fact that this show had a big orchestra. This really made it feel to me more like an older style musical like Oliver perhaps, as opposed to newer musicals where we are seeing smaller orchestra sizes, as well as the inclusion of instruments like electric guitars. Whilst of course the instruments you use in a show are going to depend on the style of music your show includes, I think it was definitely the right choice to stick with the more historical sounding big orchestra, as opposed to using modern instruments and making the music sound really modern. Likewise, I think the size of the venue of the Coliseum, you really did need that rich, deep, full body sounding orchestra sound to fill the space, as opposed to maybe a smaller orchestra that would have felt weak in comparison to the size of the venue and the size of the show that was being staged. Especially when you think about the show is set in the 1920s, having an orchestra that reflects the musical instruments of the time was really important to draw your audience in and remind them that we're not watching a show set in modern times. So I think these few small decisions to have the overture and to have a classic sounding orchestra really helped set the scene and make the audience, or at the very least me, feel this kind of sense of of nostalgia, despite the very modern elements that were present throughout the show, and that was really clever. But talking about really modern elements of the show, we have to talk about the set, which is probably one of the most technical looking sets I've seen in a while. Now, I know I've definitely made a bit of a name for myself when it comes to my reviews as to being a big hater of the use of screens and projections in musicals, so you might be surprised to find that the set of The Great Gatsby is in the highlights, whilst at the same time it also included screens and projections. Right out the gate, when you first walk into the auditorium, you see that the proscenium arch has been decorated with this gorgeous sort of Art Deco accent, and the set as well also includes a lot of similar elements, which I really liked, as in my opinion Art Deco is probably the best art style to come out of that era, and probably at the very least the most iconic, and so I appreciated that the set really leaned into this. It was also just so impressive how many times the set changed, from things being flown in and out to flats being wheeled on and off. This really helped expand and contrast different scenes to help evoke similar feelings as to what the characters might be feeling, or to really draw the audience in as to what is happening. Sometimes the space would transform so much it was hard to believe we were even looking at the same stage, which is a very impressive thing to be able to do. The difference between, say, Gatsby's parties and Nick's cottage, or even George Wilson's gas station, were really big, and so it really helped establish each setting as unique and individual. Now, moving on to talk about the screens, I think the screens were used in a really clever way. When they were, say, an internal wall in a house, they would be static, and that was fine, but then when we expanded out to have it maybe be the backdrop to George's gas station, where you've got smokestacks in the background, you could see smoke billowing and things like that, which gave it this kind of kinetic energy and sense of movement and scale. So I think this solved for me an issue I often have with screens as backdrops. It's the fact that they often feel very stale and static, which, at least in my opinion, I think makes a production look really cheap and often quite lazy. The movement, as well as the screens being used to help create this sense of depth, I think was very effectively done, particularly when layered with physical set. And these screens used most cleverly to create this sense of depth were in scenes where you had a big fly come down, maybe the front of Nick Carraway's cottage or the backdrop for the Plaza Hotel. When the doors of these physical set pieces would open, you could actually see the screen in the background had been transformed into kind of like the space beyond. So at the Plaza Hotel, it opened and you could clearly see like what was a hotel hallway, and you could see into Nick Carraway's house. The screens being used in this way to show depth beyond what we were seeing, I think was really clever and really nice, and really helped endear me to the use of screens. Another thing I really liked was the fact that they didn't skip out on anything. Whilst I think there's definitely a time and a place for more creative staging and making your audience imagine a little bit more, I really enjoyed the fact that The Great Gatsby just kind of had everything. From the edge of the stage being Gatsby's pool, to a massive cottage facade for Nick's house, and even 2 full-size cars. You didn't have to imagine anything really, and I think that allowed your brain to focus more on the dialogue you were being fed and the plot points that you were being walked through, as opposed to your attention being drawn away by having to imagine that they're in a car. I will say that the visuals of this show lean quite heavily, at least in my opinion, towards the 2013 Baz Luhrmann movie of The Great Gatsby, as opposed to maybe a more original take on the imagery presented in the novel. This was most obvious to me with the Dr. T.J. Eckelberg billboard, like the guy with the glasses, and then the cars. The Eckelberg billboard to me was very, very similar to the one in the movie. Of course, it's a key bit of iconography from the story itself. I think it was just so similar to the one in the movie that I was a little bit disappointed. Likewise with the 2 cars, to me they looked more like they'd taken their design from the cars used in that 2013 movie, as opposed to being inspired by the real cars that were described in the novel, which were obviously real cars at the time. Like, there is a 1922 Rolls Royce. It's very believable that Jay Gatsby had a 1922 Rolls Royce. What would you know, Flora's managed to find another way to talk about cars in a musical theatre review video yet again. Seeing as no one, at least to as far as I could research from the stage show, had anything to do with that 2013 Baz Luhrmann movie, I was just surprised that what was presented to me on stage echoed so much of what was presented in the movie, because you'd think that it would be an opportunity to reimagine certain things and present new ideas and present new ways of representing the key icons from the novel. But all in all, I do think the set really does a great job of taking the audience from scene to scene. I think it also adds to the overall sense of grandeur and opulence that Mr. J. Gatsby would go for at one of his parties. So I think it definitely deserves props for that, even if I do wish it maybe varied up its look here and there. Okay, I wanted to take a moment before I dove into my lowlights to talk about something that to me wasn't really a highlight or a lowlight, but I wanted to talk about anyway. And that is how fundamentally Broadway this show felt to me. Now, if you've had the privilege of seeing a show on Broadway, which I sadly haven't, then you might end up disagreeing with everything I'm about to say. So I'd love to know if you agree or disagree down in the comments. But this is just me talking about a feeling I couldn't shake whilst watching the show. Now, of course, The Great Gatsby is not the first Broadway musical to make its way across the pond to the West End, and it certainly won't be the last. But there was just something about this show that to me felt inherently more Broadway-y than other transfers that we've had in the past. I was sat there watching it like, yeah, the Americans would eat this shit up, you know? I mean, it's odd, and I hope this is making sense to at least someone, because it doesn't even really make sense to me, but even Hamilton doesn't feel as Broadway as The Great Gatsby does. Now, I don't know if it's the fact that this story and this show are so firmly rooted in the Roaring Twenties, which when most people think about it, they think about it in a very Americanized sense, due to elements of the Roaring Twenties like Prohibition and the American Dream just aren't British. I mean, our country wasn't dumb enough to try and ban alcohol. Let's be real, that would have never have worked here. So it could just be that the story of The Great Gatsby is so firmly rooted in 1920s America, and therefore it feels so much more American than other stories we have that have transferred from Broadway to the West End recently. And thus my brain is like, oh yes, very American. This must be exactly what Broadway is like. But I just could not shake that feeling. I mean, even the program here just feels like they dressed up a playbill. Now, I know it's much bigger than a playbill, it's an A4 size, but in terms of what information is available in here, as in none, it very much feels like someone put a pretty flapper dress on a playbill. And I will say, I think it's great that it feels very Broadway, at least to me, because it gives people the opportunity to get a real taste of a Broadway show without shelling out all of the money to go and visit New York. I mean, this show isn't cheap in the slightest, the median ticket price being somewhere around £100, but it's much cheaper for anyone in Europe to go and see The Great Gatsby on the West End as opposed to trekking all the way over to the USA to see it in New York. Plus, let's be real, in the current political climate, I don't think I'll be going to the USA anytime soon, even if it was for an amazing theatre trip. But like I said, I would love to know if anyone else felt this way or feels this way if they do go and see The Great Gatsby, because I really can't explain exactly precisely why I have this feeling, especially after never having seen a Broadway show. It's just a feeling that I couldn't shake, and I wanted to bring it up, that The Great Gatsby feels like an inherently Broadway show compared to, say, other shows we have on the West End at the moment. Brief detour to explore the recesses of my mind aside, let's get into the lowlights. First up in the lowlights for us today is going to be the choreography. This was one of the biggest letdowns in the show for me. I think I was just expecting more, and not only more, but more dances that were made iconic by the 1920s era. Whilst this musical did feature a number of ensemble dance numbers, none of them really had this wow factor or stood out to me. Most underwhelming for me was the 4-person tap number. A tap number where only 4 members of the ensemble were actually tap dancing to me felt particularly underwhelming, and a lot of the movement throughout the show oddly just felt entirely too modern and therefore out of place for a musical set in 1922. A lot of it also felt really compact on the stage, and I think I would have liked to have seen it expand and contract a little bit more, particularly in moments where there's not a lot of set dressing going on and therefore they have more room to move about. It seemed odd to me that so much of it was condensed into kind of a group. I would also have loved to have seen a few more movements or dance numbers that were inspired a bit more by, like I said, dances that were iconic at the time, which probably most notably was the Charleston, but dances like the Foxtrot were also big back then. I think the Roaring Twenties, in my mind, saw the creation and cultivation of a lot of iconic dances, and to see so little of that represented in the movement of the show, I think was a little bit disappointing. The show also falls short of the grand dance numbers of musicals of the past by having leads who I would describe as strong movers, not dancers. I just wish our leads had been a tad better at dancing, because bless him, Jamie Moscato, as much as I love him, was distracting when he was in the big dance numbers, simply because he wasn't quite as polished. It didn't feel like he was finishing his moves to the same degree that the ensemble were. Corbin Bleu himself was captivating to watch, despite the fact that he's probably most famous for playing a character that once said, I really enjoyed watching him. He just seemed to have so much joy in moving his body on stage. It was lovely. I just think overall, given the size of the stage, the dancing could have been bigger and bolder and mixed in with a few more historical dance steps to really help balance that feeling of 1920s similarities with a more modern musical that we were seeing with other elements of the show that I mentioned in the highlights. Second low light for me was the pacing. The pacing of this show wasn't quite as polished as I thought it would be, given that it has been running on Broadway for quite a while now. Some scenes really felt like they dragged on, and others felt rushed through as if someone had a checklist of iconic scenes from the book that they just had to include. Act 2 to me was definitely far better paced than Act 1, but the divisions of scenes and songs just felt unbalanced overall. The show didn't sort of seem to put its story on hold for each song, which I know some adaptations feel like. The music did carry the story forward for the most part, although I do feel like some songs like Just Tea did a better job of advancing the story as well as giving us an insight into how the characters were feeling than others. I did really like the fact that the musical didn't feel as though it was using the source material as too much of a crutch to prop itself up. With some shows based on movies and books, I feel as though they rely quite heavily on an audience's awareness of a source material to help connect the dots. So if you aren't familiar with the source material, you can't connect those dots and therefore you're left confused by the plot of a story. The Great Gatsby musical didn't do that. I feel like the story made a lot of sense and everything flowed quite smoothly, even coming at it from a standpoint of very little knowledge of the source material. There were a few moments, however, that to me felt a bit out of the blue and uncalled for. Most notably, I would have to say, is Daisy's reaction to finding out that Gatsby made his money basically with bootleg alcohol. Her reaction seemed a little bit uncalled for, over the top, if you will, just because I don't feel like at any point prior to that we'd really been given an insight into where Daisy's morals lie. Like, my girl was okay with adultery and having an affair, but the distribution of illegal booze in Prohibition era America was like one step too far for her. To each their own, it just seemed a bit disproportionate. I just think for such a long musical, kind of to wrap this rambling up, there were times where we spent way too long in one moment and other times where I could have spent slightly longer in a moment. And it's just surprising to me because often pacing issues are something that are resolved with time, but that doesn't seem to be the case with this musical. And then moving on, we're finally on our final low light, and that is going to be the sound for me. Something just wasn't quite right. Now, I'm often willing to chalk this up to tech issues, but I think here the balance of the sound was just slightly off kilter. Despite the musical having a large ensemble, at least by modern West End standards, the big group vocal numbers felt really muted. They were often way too quiet relative to the orchestra or to the lead singing at the same time. It legit sounded like they'd forgotten to turn microphones on at various points. I couldn't help but thinking that they perhaps needed a backing track, like backing vocals for these ensemble-led numbers to really drive home their impact, particularly with the opening number like roaring on. It felt just a little bit reserved and too quiet for my liking for an opening number. I think the ensemble numbers would fare better being louder in a venue as big as this, and they would also hold their own a little bit better against such strong solo performances. Lyrics were also at times quite difficult to understand. They were hard to make out over the orchestra, which in turn made certain moments hard to follow. Now, this again isn't necessarily a direct flaw with The Great Gatsby as a musical, and it's also something that can be impacted by something as simple as where you are sat in a theatre, depending on how they've decided to set up their speakers and pan different sounds. It's just a little bit disappointing when you've paid X amount for a ticket to see a show like this, and then you can't understand half of it because you can't hear what they're saying. And tying into that, there were moments of layered vocals where you had two or more leads singing different lines at the same time, and it was just noise, right? It wasn't discernible. I was kind of sat there being like, what is going on? Because I couldn't make out what each individual was saying, and it wasn't layering together in a way that was very pleasing. And again, this was quite jarring relative to the very crisp vocals that we're getting in solo moments. And I think that's why sound has ended up in the lowlights, because the sound quality had such a detrimental impact on my ability to enjoy the show. Because if you can't understand a show, you can't fully enjoy it, if that makes sense. Now, I know I said at the start of this video that I wouldn't be comparing the musical to the F. Scott Fitzgerald novel, and I'm not, but the biggest thing I kept hearing around me whilst I was at the theatre was that this musical was a very bad adaptation of the novel. And okay, maybe it does do a really bad job of adapting it. Obviously, having not read the book, I can't really speak to that, but I don't think it's trying to be a flawless recreation or reimagining of that 1925 book. I think a good way of describing it, a good comparison, if you will, is that this version of The Great Gatsby is to the F. Scott Fitzgerald novel as Disney's adaptation of the Snow White is to the Grimm's brothers' original fairy tale. It's not so widely removed from the source material that it's kind of just using the name and a few vague themes, kind of like The Knight's Tale and Canterbury Tales. It takes just enough from the original material to be considered an adaptation of, as opposed to kind of loosely based on, if you will. But at the same time, it's not parading itself around pretending to be this perfect adaptation. I think, weirdly, the biggest giveaway that it wasn't going to be a super faithful adaptation was the program, which I have here. This program has literally zero information on the source material. I have here my programs for Clueless and Calamity Jane, both adaptations of something and both having pages dedicated to discussing the source material. And whilst the Calamity Jane program is factually incorrect to a wild degree, see my Calamity Jane video for more on that, but they both still try to bring the audience up to speed with the source material that the musical is based on. And I was genuinely so surprised that the Great Gatsby program didn't do that. And I don't think it being a bad adaptation of the Great Gatsby necessarily makes it a bad musical. I know I said it earlier, but I think it deserves props for not using the source material to prop itself up, whereby an audience feels as though they can't connect the dots or they're missing key pieces of information because they haven't read the book. So I can totally understand why diehard Great Gatsby book fans aren't going to like this production. To be honest, before going to see the Great Gatsby, I didn't know that there were like diehard fangirls of the book. But I don't think it's fair for everyone to write this show off simply because it's a bad adaptation of the book. It is still a fun musical. I think the musical also still delivers on key elements and themes from the book. You know, it touches on the decline of the American dream, and it also goes over the class disparities and conflicts arising in the 1920s. It also, of course, includes the more vague themes of love, morality, and changing identities. And whilst the musical has definitely diluted those themes to make it more consumable to the average audience, I don't think it's fair to damn the whole musical because of that. So whilst I said I wouldn't be comparing the musical to the book at the start of this video, I still wanted to take a moment to talk about the fact that whilst others totally have the right to compare and contrast if they wish, I think you can go and see this show without the context of the novel and still have it make sense and have the same themes presented to you in an enjoyable way. All in all, I had a thoroughly fun time at The Great Gatsby. It's a glitzy, large-scale musical that does really well to invoke the nostalgia of older musicals, whilst also at the same time being innovative and new. It definitely feels like it's going to occupy the same niche on the West End as something like Mamma Mia, with regards to the experience it's going to provide audiences. It's fun for hen-dos and easy to watch that like enjoying theatre in a more casual capacity, but if you're looking for something to really sink your teeth into with a lot of meat on its bone with regards to the story it's telling, this maybe isn't the show for you. I do also think that of the two Fitzgerald novels that have been I do also think of the two Fitzgerald novels that have been adapted into stage musicals and are currently on the West End, The Great Gatsby is the weaker of the two, with Benjamin Button being, in my opinion, a significantly better musical with how it adapts the themes of the novel. And I know I've said it, but if you're a diehard fan of the novel, I don't think the musical adaptation of it is going to be your cup of tea. But as someone totally ignorant of the novel, I still found the story to make sense and feel compelling, whilst at the same time being digestible in a fun musical format. Of course, this show is running at the London Coliseum until the 7th of September, so you guys have plenty of time to go and check it out for yourselves. If you have seen it either on Broadway or the West End, then I would love to hear your own thoughts and feelings about the show, as I know I'm coming at it from a very different standpoint than a lot of people. If you managed to stick around until the end of the video, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed it and want more stagey content in the future, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on my future videos. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one, guys. Bye!